One of the best ways to learn how to create your own guitar solos is to study great solos from other players. But too often we learn the notes, get a solo under our fingers, maybe record a cover for Instagram, and then move on to the next solo. But there's so much more we can get out of studying a great solo than just that. In this video, I'm going to take a look at a classic short melodic solo by the great David Gilmour. The song's Mother from The Wall, and it's an easy enough solo that just about any guitarist can learn to play it. But I want to look under the hood and show you how it works and see how you can apply lessons from it to your lead playing. My goal here is not to teach you how to play this specific solo, it's to teach you how to think about solos in a way that will help you get more out of the process. And even though this one is short and doesn't have a lot of notes, I'm going to show you how to extract 5 Gilmourisms that we can isolate and learn to apply in other contexts. So first, here's the solo, more or less as it was originally recorded. Every solo exists in the context of a song's harmony. They're usually played over a sequence of chords, and they're almost always made up of smaller phrases. When learning a solo, it's important to learn the chord progression, even though you're not necessarily playing the chords. This is because each phrase of the solo relates to the chords, and we need to understand that relationship if we want to learn something from one solo and apply it to another. This solo section, and in fact this whole song, is in the key of G major. There are just 3 chords, G, C, and D. In the Nashville number system, those are the 1, 4, and 5 chords. In the solo section, we go from G to C 3 times before finally reaching a climax with the 5-chord D, and then resolving back through C to G. Typical scale choices to play over these chords would be G major and G major pentatonic. These scales would work well with all 3 chords. In fact, the G major scale is what you get if you add together all the notes from the G, C, and D chords. You could also play the C major pentatonic scale over the C chord and the D major pentatonic scale over the D chord. Those 3 pentatonic scales, G, C, and D, all live inside the G major scale, and visualizing those pentatonic scales separately can be a good way to highlight the right notes at the right time. I have other videos about how to visualize scales for improvisation, so I won't go into those details here. If I was in a jam session and I had to improvise a solo on this song without thinking much about it beforehand, I'd probably hang out in the Form 1 G major pentatonic scale at the 12th fret and use my knowledge of cowboy chords to visualize target notes for the 3 chords. I might also use my hidden in plain sight method to turn the G major pentatonic scale into the G major scale. But I don't think David Gilmour was thinking about scales when he wrote this solo. As you'll see, he specifically targets notes from every chord as they go by. Let's look at a solo phrase by phrase and you'll see what I mean. Part of the key to getting the most out of learning a solo is to study each phrase and understand what it's saying and how you could paraphrase it in another context. This is what musicians are talking about when they talk about developing vocabulary. It's not just learning licks, it's about understanding how a particular lick works in different contexts. As we look at each phrase in the solo, we'll want to notice any notes that are emphasized. Not all notes carry the same weight. Which ones are held longer? Which ones are hit harder? Which ones fall on strong beats? We should understand how those specific notes relate to the chords that are played over because those things are usually connected. And we'll also want to look at which scale or arpeggio is being used to connect those notes together. Most of the time, a phrase will have 1 or 2 emphasized notes that are related to the chords, and they'll be connected by a scale fragment that fits the key. As I talk about each phrase, I'll use a style of visualization I've developed that I think helps with this process, but if you're new to the channel, it will likely seem a little unusual. In my diagrams, I always use red circles to indicate the root of a chord or scale, green diamonds are thirds, and blue squares are fifths. I'll show other notes in black, and I'll highlight the emphasized notes with yellow. If there's an underlying pentatonic scale, I'll show that with red rectangles and blue boxes that come from my rectangle and stack method of understanding the pentatonic scale. If you haven't seen that, there's a link in the video description. There's a lot of information in these diagrams, but I've tried to design them so that you can focus on the piece you're mainly interested in, and the other elements should fade into the background. If you're interested in this kind of analysis, I invite you to check out the Fret Science Patreon, where I'm analyzing other classic solos, And I'm also rolling out a course with step-by-step instructions for how to learn to improvise your own melodic solos over chord changes. The first phrase of Gilmour's solo is built around a D note, which is the fifth of the G chord. It's easy to visualize potential target notes in this area of the neck if you think about cowboy chord shapes. Just for reference, the scales that would be in play here are the G major pentatonic scale and the G major scale. And specifically what Gilmour does is start at the root of the chord on the 12th fret of the G string, and then bends the 4th at the 13th fret of the B string up to play the 5th of the chord. In the second half of the phrase, the target notes come from the C chord. Gilmour targets both the root and the 3rd on the B and D strings, and he does it by decorating the notes with chromatic notes. This sets up a motif that he returns to later a couple of times in the solo. In music theory, you could call this kind of decoration a partial chromatic enclosure, and you can practice it with any chord voicing or arpeggio you can think of. If I wanted to extend this idea to the full C shape, I'd visualize the arpeggio and then I'd start at the lowest note and work my way up, adding in the chromatic neighbor for each note. So that's one idea you can take away from this solo, using the lower neighbor of a chord tone to decorate a target note. The chromatic note doesn't even have to be in the key, it just goes by so fast we hear it as a decoration. In the third measure, we're back to a G chord, and Gilmour uses parallel sixths to target the 3rd and 5th of the chord. I play this on the A and G string. If you know how to play the major scale on one string and you can keep track of which scale degree you're playing, it's pretty easy to make harmonies with 3rds and 6ths like this. I have a whole video about it, so I won't go into full detail here. The upper notes are the 3rd and 4th scale degrees B and C, which are separated by 1 fret. When I play this lick, these are the 2 notes that I visualize. The lower notes are a minor 6th down from the 4th and a major 6th down from the 3rd. And this is a lick that we could move to other places on the fretboard. There's a B and C up at the 7th and 8th fret of the high E string, so we could play it there. Or up here at the 12th fret on the B string. And this exact lick works over a 5 chord just as well as a 1 chord. So over D, we could play it up here at the 14th fret, or down here at the 7th. So that's idea number 2 that we can take from this solo. When the C chord returns, Gilmour continues the phrase by targeting the root note of C at the 3rd fret of the A string, with another partial chromatic enclosure. Then he bends up from the root to the 2nd and back. Toward the end of that measure, he anticipates the next G chord by sliding up toward the G on the 8th fret of the B string, but turns it into a mini arpeggio by playing the 5th of the chord at the 7th fret of the G string. What comes next is classic Gilmour. He wants to target the 3rd, but instead of playing the 3rd on the high E string, he does a dramatic bend between the 2nd and 3rd of the G up at the 10th fret of the B string. And this is the third idea that you can steal and use elsewhere. Slide up to the 5th, alternate with the root a string higher, and then bend the 2nd up to the 3rd. We can do the same thing an octave higher up here at the 15th fret. And we could play the same kind of idea over a minor chord by bending up a half step to the minor 3rd instead of the major 3rd. Over an E minor, that would be something like this. Over the next C chord, Gilmour tags the root on the high E string and then echoes the chromatic decoration he used earlier, this time focusing on the 3rd of the C chord on the G string. And now finally we approach the climax of the solo over the 5 chord, D major. Gilmour really leans into it by raking up to the root on the E string and then quickly going into a bend up to the 3rd by bending the 2nd at the 12th fret up a whole step and then descending back down to the root. This is a lot like the move we just did over the last G chord, but with a rake and returning down to the root instead of the double bend. He repeats the same phrase over the C chord 2 frets lower. And this little lick works over any E-shaped major bar chord. You rake up to the root, grab the 2nd 2 frets higher, bend it up a whole step to the 3rd, and then descend back to the root. You can do it for minor chords too. Let's say we had an E minor chord. We could rake up the top 3 strings at the 12th fret up to the root and then bend the 2nd up a half step to reach the flat 3rd. So that's a fourth cool idea we can take away from this solo. And now we're about to reach the last chord in the solo, which is the 1 chord, G. Gilmour anticipates it by playing a descending G arpeggio with an added fourth. You can visualize it as being the arpeggio made out of form 3 of the major pentatonic scale, or you might think of that as the D-shaped arpeggio. He starts up at the top and works his way down to land on the root at the 5th fret of the D string. The notes of the arpeggio are the 4th, 3rd, root, and 5th, and by landing on the root, he creates a nice sense of closure and resolution and brings the solo to a satisfying end. That little lick adding the 4th to a major triad arpeggio is something that Gilmour also uses in his Comfortably Numb solo, and it's one of the bits from this one that I often steal to use in my own solos. You don't have to do it on the D-shaped version of the chord. In Comfortably Numb, he does a version of this over the A shape on an A chord, like this. And that's a 5th idea to steal. So what have we learned from this simple little solo? We pulled out 5 phrase ideas we can borrow: the partial chromatic enclosure, the parallel 6th approach to a major chord, the arpeggio with a bend up to the 3rd, the rake up to a root followed by a bend to the 3rd and then back down to the root, and a descending arpeggio with an added 4th. We also saw that David Gilmour targeted chord tones on every chord of this progression, and even though there aren't a lot of notes in this solo, he makes it memorable by using a recurring chromatic motif and some expressive bends. This approach of looking at a great solo phrase by phrase and thinking about how the emphasized notes relate to the chord progression is the best way I know to accelerate your progress as a melodic soloist. If you're interested in this kind of analysis, I invite you to check out the Fret Science Patreon, where I'm analyzing other classic solos, and I'm also rolling out a course with step-by-step instructions for how to learn to improvise your own melodic solos over chord changes. In any case, please like and subscribe and check out my other videos. I'll see you next time.